For 5 years, Doctor Who had been flying strong under the tenure of Richard Griffiths' 8th Doctor. Following on from the show's darkest hour, Griffiths was able to turn the show into a success. Behind the scenes, the show had undertaken some radical changes, with it now being produced by independent company Carnival Films, and the series format being changed to a more contemporary 45-minute pop runtime. But now the 8th Doctor's time had reached an end, and a new chapter in the mythos was about to begin, with the 9th Doctor. Season 33 of Doctor Who would have starred Hugh Bonneville as the 9th Doctor, along with Lisa Bauman as Bernice Summerfield, Robert Baffus as Chris Hector, and Beverly Cressman as new companion Abigail Norwood. It would also see Stephen Garwood acting as producer, with Colin Brake as script editor. Season 33 would see the debut of the new 9th Doctor, played by Hugh Bonneville. Garwood and Brake wished for the new 9th Doctor to be a complete opposite to Griffiths' 8th Doctor. Someone younger, more energetic, and a bit whimsical. Originally, Garwood wanted a well-known actor to play the role in order to entice new viewers to the show. However, after being sold on Bonneville's audition, and despite being a relatively unknown actor at the time, it was agreed that he would be a right fit for the role. The new Doctor's outfit would be an Edwardian-inspired get-up. It would consist of a dark brown coat and trousers, with a dark red waistcoat with pocket watch, a dark red cravat, white shirt and black shoes. A new title sequence was commissioned for the new season, along with a new logo and theme music. Still wishing to emulate the likes of Star Trek Voyager, this title sequence would retain a space travel aesthetic while showing off the Earth and glowing nebulas in space. For the first time since the original title sequence, the Doctor's face would not appear in the titles. Instead, we would have the main cast credited on screen. For the new theme music, regular composer Gavin Greenaway was given the task. His take on the theme was a lot more synth heavy than the previous theme, and offered a slower pace to accompany the new titles. It was during production of Season 3 that both Bauman and Bathurst announced that they would be stepping down from their respective roles. Originally, Garwood planned to introduce the new companion in episode 1 of Season 34. However, it was during the production of the final story of Season 33 that Brake, who would also be leaving at the end of this season, suggested turning a character in this story, a detective named Abigail Norwood, into the next companion. And after speaking to the actress cast in the role, Beverly Cressman, the script was changed to have Abigail join the Doctor on his adventures. Season 33 would air between the 6th of July 1996 and the 21st of September 1996. It would consist of 12 episodes across 7 stories, with 2 single-parters and 5 two-parters, and would go out weekly on Saturday night. This story sees the TARDIS crash landing in Little Cadwell, where Isaac takes in Bernice and Chris, along with the new Doctor, who's currently dealing with post-regeneration after effects. We initially see the trio helping the Doctor stabilise and help him find himself. All 3 of them are aware of regeneration to certain degrees, yet Bernice, and more so Chris, are finding it hard to adjust to the new Doctor. We also see the group dealing with a potential alien invasion. The Pyramid has received signals from an unknown alien life form nearby, as well as reports concerning dead people coming back to life. Realising that there may be a potential threat to Earth at play, and with the Doctor not fully formed yet, the trio take it upon themselves to find out about these body-snatching aliens. They find that the bodies of the dead are being possessed by a race known as the Lampsai, who explain that they originated from Earth. They explained that they used to be a humanoid-like race and coexisted with the Silurians. However, when Earth came under threat from destruction by a meteor, the Lampsai were able to abandon their bodies and evolve into creatures of light. They then left Earth, never to return, as they believed it and the Silurians to be destroyed. Now that they have discovered Earth did indeed survive, they wish to return to their home planet. However, as their original forms rotted away centuries ago and can no longer de-evolve, they can now only communicate in solid forms using the bodies of the dead. The Lampsai mean no harm to the humans and simply wish to live in peace on their planet of origin. Bernice, Chris and Isaac are somewhat reluctant to trust the Lampsai, but they go along with their story for the time being. However, relationships begin to collapse when an angry group of humans begin attacking the Lampsai with rocks, calling them immoral. This begins to escalate the situation, with factions in both races that hate the other race beginning to emerge. We then see the Doctor, who is fully recovered by this point, attempting to negotiate peace between the humans and the Lampsai, attempting to make a case for coexistence, and hearing valid points from both races. The negotiations appear to be moving smoothly when the ceasefire is broken by a rising faction of rogue Lampsai, who believe the humans to be a lower form of evolution compared to them, comparing them to dung beetles. This then causes a human faction to emerge, who see the Lampsai as unnatural and pure evil, who wage war against the Lampsai. Eventually the ceasefire is restored when the Doctor disables every weapon and uses an EMP-like device to expel the Lampsai from their bodies. Realising that peace between the two races is currently impossible and would likely result in a full-blown nuclear war, the Doctor arranges to have the Lampsai taken to a new planet, where they'll be given the means to grow artificial bodies and build a new society. However, he tells both humans and Lampsai that he one day hopes that the two races can share the planet together, and so he tells the Lampsai that they will try again in 1,000 years or so, when humans are more accepting of other races. The story then ends with the Lampsai being teleported away to a new planet by the Doctor. He then thanks Bernice, Chris and Isaac for helping him through his regeneration, as well as personally thanking Isaac for the clothes, his new outfit being sourced from Isaac's wardrobe. The Doctor, Bernice and Chris then say goodbye to Isaac as they return to the TARDIS. This story sees the Doctor, Bernice and Chris investigating strange reports of children being kidnapped across Europe in 1919, with the only clue being a toy bear each child owned. After some deep investigation, they track the children down to a planet named Quell. It turns out that the children are being kidnapped by a machine named the Recruiter. We learn that the Recruiter was a machine created by a race named the Quell, who yes, do share the same name as their planet, to help them in their battles against their enemies, the Saraki. However, the machine got damaged and forced the war to continue, with it justifying that warfare acted as a spur to technological prowess. It also began kidnapping children from across the universe and conditioned them into soldiers. Eventually, the Doctor is able to stop the Recruiter by reprogramming it to end the war with the Saraki and the Quell, as well as returning the children back to normal and sending them home. This story sees the Doctor, Bernice and Chris arriving on Basalt 2, a small colony world, where they see the people of the planet living in peace and harmony. Through some conversations with the locals, they find that the people of Basalt 2 worship a god named the God of Heat, who takes the form of a giant phoenix and lives within the core of the planet. The Doctor initially believes this god to be just a myth, however he soon discovers that the God of Heat is a real entity who controls the planet. We learn that for 1,000 years, the God of Heat has offered the planet enough food, water and supplies all year round. However, in return for all of this, he demands a yearly sacrifice. The Doctor, naturally appalled by this, decides to investigate, and eventually concludes that the God of Heat isn't a real god, but a giant parasite known as a Vortworm, that feeds off the yearly sacrifices. The story then sees the trio attempting to convince the people of the planet that their god is fake, and trying to form some form of evidence that proves him guilty. Initially, the Doctor and his companions aren't believed, and the Vortworm uses his status as god to trick the people into believing the strangers to be servants of Baphomet, who is Basalt's true form of the devil. However, the Doctor is able to start winning around the population when he uses a device to expose the Vortworm in its real form, a twisted, bubbling, flaming shape of fire. With the Vortworm exposed as a simple parasite, it burns in rage and attempts to destroy the planet by merging with the planet's core and turning the world into a fiery hell. However, the Doctor, along with the leaders of Basalt 2, are able to defeat the Vortworm by filling the planet with water and basalt fish, which merges with the Vortworm and turns it into stone. However, without realising, the Doctor has inadvertently caused the death of everyone on Basalt 2, as without heat in the planet's centre, the planet begins to drop in temperature, which kills everyone but the Doctor, Bernice and Chris. This story sees the Doctor, Bernice and Chris arriving on a library planet, simply known as the Library. To their confusion, they discover the planet to be completely empty. After some exploring, they discover a team of archaeologists representing the Feldman Lux Corporation, led by Strackman Lux. They explained that they were sent to investigate the planet, which has been sealed off for a century, with the only message from the library being 4,022 saved, no survivors. As the group begins to explore the library, they realise that there is something living within the shadows, which the Doctor identifies as the Vastra Narada, literally meaning the shadow that melts the flesh. The group soon begin to be attacked by the Vastra, with 2 of the expeditioners having their flesh eaten and left as skeletons in their spacesuits. The Vastra, now trapped within their suits, then begin using their bodies to follow after the cast. Realising that his companions are in danger, the Doctor teleports Bernice back to the safety of the TARDIS with the library's teleporters, although Chris refuses to go. However, Bernice fails to make it safely back to the TARDIS, and her consciousness is saved to the planet's data core hard drive by a system named Cal, which the Doctor and Chris soon discover when they find an interface machine with Bernice's face on it, constantly repeating that Bernice is safe and has left the library. We then see Bernice, seemingly alive but in the hospital on Earth, where a strange man named Dr. Moon easily convinces her that the library was just a dream and she is a patient of his. We then see time progressing, which seems to be led by Bernice's thoughts. We see flashes of her life over what appears to be several years, as she meets a man with a stammer named Lee, goes on a date with him, gets married and has 2 kids with him. Back in the library, we see the Doctor's group fleeing from the approaching Vastra Narada. He manages to communicate with them, where he learns that the library was their forest, their home, until the library was built on it. The Doctor then realises that the 4,022 people being saved literally meant that they had been teleported and saved into the data core, and the same had been done with Bernice. Meanwhile, in Bernice's sequence, we see her being watched by a strange hooded figure who wishes to speak to Bernice the following day. Bernice goes along to meet her, where they reveal themselves to be what remains of one of the archaeologists from the library, whose consciousness was copied when she was killed. She tries to warn Bernice that she's in a simulation of sorts, showing her that her children are just simulations, and nothing makes sense when you really look and think, but Bernice refuses to believe her. Suddenly a warning is emitted in the library. The core is going into meltdown. With little time to save the people in the core, the Doctor orders Strackman to take him to the core. We see Bernice trying to take care of her children, slowly questioning whether she is in reality or not. She then attempts to tuck them in for the night when they vanish in the blink of an eye, leaving Bernice in hysterics. The Doctor and Chris are then taken down to the core of the planet to the computer where Cal is being stored, where it's revealed that Cal is actually a child named Charlotte Abigail Lux, Strackman's grandfather's youngest daughter. Throughout the episode, we would have seen brief scenes of this child in the living room in a normal life. She believes the library to be a place in her head and receives therapy from Dr. Moon, who eventually reveals that the library is indeed real. She then eventually starts seeing both the library and Bernice's life on TV. Strackman explains to the Doctor that Cal was dying of an incurable disease, so her father made her an imaginary world to live in, and every book ever written for her to enjoy. He also gave her a Dr. Moon to watch over her, but the stress of having so many minds integrated into her own, as well as learning the truth about her dream through Bernice, has caused her to overload, resulting in the core going into meltdown. Realising the computer needs more memory, the Doctor devises a plan to connect his mind into it, and intimidates the swarm of Vastra Narada into giving him a single day to save the people of the core. However, believing that it should be Cal's own blood that saves her, Strackman chooses to sacrifice himself to boost the library's memory, thus enabling it to return the people who'd been saved into the core, including Bernice. The story then ends with Bernice searching around the library for Lee, but being unable to find him. We also see the Doctor looking around the library before he finds an old book standing on a grand lectern. He looks at the cover of the book and the title reads, Doctor Who. He thinks to himself for a moment, before ultimately deciding that he doesn't like spoilers. This story sees the Doctor taking Bernice and Chris to the space station Satellite 5 in the year 200,000, the fourth great and bountiful human empire, to see the human race at its height. However, the Doctor realises that something is wrong with history in Satellite 5. Technology appears to be primitive for the year 200,000. Every floor is boiling hot, and the human race is less accepting of alien races. The story would see the Doctor investigating into Satellite 5 with help from a journalist named Kafka. She tells the Doctor about how Satellite 5 acts as a news broadcast for the people on Earth, as well as control over Satellite 5 taking place on floor 500, a floor where the walls are apparently made out of gold, and how no one ever returns from floor 500. Believing that whatever caused history to be wrong originates from floor 500, the Doctor and his companions decide to travel to floor 500 to investigate. There they find the control room, where they find frozen corpses operating the controls, as well as a mysterious man named the Editor, who promptly captures the Doctor and his companions. The Doctor initially believes the Editor to be the main villain, but the Editor reveals himself to be a humble servant, before directing their attention to the ceiling. The trio look up and see a giant fleshy creature on the ceiling. It turns out that Satellite 5, and also Earth, is being controlled by a creature known as the Jagrafess. The Editor tells the Doctor that the Jagrafess has been manipulating the Empire by controlling the news, changing the population's social, economic and technological growth, and making it more insular and xenophobic, meaning the human race has been reduced to slavery without even realising it. The Doctor also discovers that the reason why every floor, bar floor 500, is incredibly warm is because the Jagrafess needs cold air to survive, so it channels the air to the lower levels. The Editor then threatens to kill Bernice unless the Doctor reveals who he and his companions are, which he's forced to do. After searching through Earth's history and learning more about who the Doctor is, the Jagrafess begins to form a new plan to steal the TARDIS and manipulate all of human history in its favour. Eventually, however, the Jagrafess is defeated when Kafka, who spied and overheard everything the Editor told the Doctor, channels all the heat in Satellite 5 to floor 500, which allows the Doctor and his companions to escape, as well as causing the Jagrafess to overheat and explode, which also kills the Editor. This story sees the Doctor taking Bernice to visit her father in Little Cadwell. We see Bernice spending time with her father and helping him run the pyramid for a while she gets more acquainted and familiar with the team. Meanwhile, the Doctor and Chris decide to have a stroll around the area as they wait for Bernice. However, the two of them are quickly thrown into danger when Chris is attacked by a deranged woman with plant roots growing out of her skin. The Doctor rescues Chris and uses hypnosis to calm the woman. He questions why she attacked Chris, to which she explains that she had no choice, that something within her is in control. The Doctor then questions the plant roots growing out of her, asking what did this to her. She explains that she was told that she would be cured by the Great Mother. The Doctor asks who this Great Mother is, however he fails to get an answer as the woman collapses dead to the ground. The two of them then return to the pyramid, where they learn more about this Great Mother from the team. They learn that she's in charge of a new research facility named Natural Existence, which claims to be able to kill off cancer cells and other medical illnesses using plant matter. Sensing that something is wrong with the company, the Doctor decides to investigate. The story then sees the Doctor and co gaining access to the Natural Existence facility by gaining employmentship as scientists in order to learn more about the company and its Great Mother. After some snooping, they discover an off-limits wing within the facility, where they discover strange-looking doctors injecting patients with a strange green substance. The subjects begin to twitch and scream in pain as their skin begins to turn green and roots and other plant matter begin to spout out of their bodies. Further investigation leads them to discover that this Great Mother is planning on creating a new form of life known as a flora, a half-human, half-plant hybrid, using the people in the facility as guinea pigs. They find confidential documents which details on how the flora can infect and turn any humanoid life form into other flora, and how they'll eventually become the dominant life on Earth. After some snooping, Bernice and Isaac find themselves being caught and captured by the strange doctors, who take them to the Great Mother herself, who is revealed to be none other than the Rani. The story then sees the Doctor and Chris working with the pyramid to try and stop the Rani and their flora from taking over the Earth, as well as rescuing Bernice and Isaac before the Rani can experiment on them. The group eventually make their way to the facilities where they're able to rescue Bernice in time. However, they're unable to save Isaac, who's injected with the green substance, which slowly turns him into a flora. Eventually, the Doctor is able to stop the flora uprising by creating a form of weed killer, which either kills or completely weakens every flora. With her plans foiled, the Rani attempts to escape in her TARDIS. The Doctor chases after her but can't keep up. The Rani turns a corner where she's suddenly grabbed by the infected Isaac, who proceeds to bite into her hand, infecting her with the flora virus. The Rani then pulls out a staser and shoots Isaac dead to the ground, before dashing into her TARDIS and dematerialising. The Doctor, Bernice, Chris and the Pyramid team surround Isaac's body as he begins to die. He looks at Bernice and tells her that he's proud of her. Bernice and Isaac say their final goodbyes before Isaac shuts his eyes and falls completely dead, leaving Bernice in tears. The story would then end a few days later after a funeral is held for Isaac. The Doctor asks Bernice and Chris if they're ready to go. Chris says he guesses so, but Bernice, after a minute's pause, tells the Doctor that she isn't coming. She says that in the wake of her father's death, there's no one to run the pyramid. She then says that she's choosing to stay on Earth in order to run the pyramid in her father's honour. The Doctor hugs Bernice and wishes her luck before returning to the TARDIS. Chris makes his farewells to Bernice, saying that he'll truly miss her. Bernice gives him a quick kiss on the cheek before saying goodbye to Chris. The two hug one final time before Chris returns to the TARDIS. This story begins with the Doctor and Chris in the year 2985 to witness a peace treaty being signed between humans and Lamsai after the two races were finally able to settle their differences. However, the peace conference is suddenly broken up when the Lamsai leader is assassinated by a human sniper on live TV. Panic and chaos ensues across the Earth, with war breaking out left, right and centre. The Doctor then tells Chris that this is wrong. Everything. Today should have marked the dawn of a new age of peace, not war. Something or someone has changed history. Realising that this must link back to the assassin, the Doctor and Chris realise they need help to track him down. They soon meet with a detective named Abigail Norwood to try and track down the assassin. However, Abigail finds that there is no record of this man. Eventually, however, the trio are able to locate and apprehend the assassin. Abigail then downloads his mind into a futuristic machine, which lets her read the minds of people who were trying to hide a criminal act, where she discovers that this man, named Miles, is somehow from the year 2025. The Doctor then finds that Miles has a strange primitive time travel device around his arm, causing him to conclude that somehow this man from the 2020s gained the ability to time travel. Realising the potential danger he may have caused, the Doctor concludes that they must find out where and when he has been to and stop him before he can destroy time itself. However, before he can do so, the Doctor uses the time device to travel back in time in order to stop Miles from killing the Lamsai leader. He disables his sniper, locks him out of his time travel device and sends him back to his time of origin before returning to the present to pick up Chris. Chris and Abigail then enter the TARDIS, where the Doctor plugs the time device into the TARDIS's console in order to find out where and when has been affected. However, before the Doctor can notice Abigail on board, he takes off. After realising his mistake, the Doctor apologises to Abigail and says that he'll return her home as soon as history is saved. After analysing the device, he discovers that Miles has also travelled to America in 1967. There they find themselves near NASA, and after some investigating, they find Miles under disguise as a NASA engineer. The Doctor then discovers the date, the 27th of January, and realises that Miles is attempting to stop the Apollo 1 disaster, a fire that broke out in the cabin during the launch simulation, which caused the death of all 3 astronauts. Miles quickly makes the necessary repairs to stop the disaster. However, when Miles leaves and teleports to the future, the Doctor is forced to quickly undo his repairs to the Apollo 1 craft, meaning the fire still happens, an action which the Doctor isn't happy of. The trio then return to the TARDIS, where the Doctor attempts to get Abigail home. However, his plan is cancelled as the TARDIS has found out where and how Miles obtained the time travel device. Arriving in 2025, they find that Miles was a member of an organisation named Broken Clock. The Doctor discovers that Broken Clock is selling time travel to the rich and wealthy. They simply equip a time device around your arm, set a destination on a keypad, and a gateway opens up. You then step through the gateway and end up in your destination, and you return to the present using the time device on your wrist. Realising that Broken Clock needs to be burnt to the ground, the Doctor, Chris and Abigail sneak into the organisation's main building to try and stop their source of time travel before any more damage can be done to the timelines. The Doctor force returns everyone in history wearing a time device to the present and tries to shut down the main reactor. However, he accidentally sets it to overload and the giant gateway opens up on the time vortex, which begins to suck everything and everyone nearby, sending them to anywhere and anywhen in time and space. The trio work together to try and fully shut down the gateway. However, the force becomes too strong and pulls Chris in. The Doctor grabs him by the arm but is slowly losing his grip. The Doctor ends up losing his grip and begins to be pulled through when Abigail suddenly snatches the Doctor by the arm. Time's running out. Soon Abigail will also lose her grip. The Doctor tells Chris that he's sorry, but he doesn't think he can save him. Chris tells the Doctor that he knows, and that he'll be fine. Just save the world. The Doctor says goodbye to Chris, and Chris replies with, "Goodbye, Doctor. Give my regards to Benny." He then nods his head in respect before the Doctor is forced to let go and watches Chris fall into the time vortex. Abigail then pulls the Doctor back up, where they continue to shut down the gateway. Eventually the gateway is shut down and the time vortex is closed. The Doctor thanks Abigail for her support before she states that she's sorry about Chris. The Doctor responds saying that it wasn't her fault and at the very least, he's alive out there. Somewhere, somewhen. The story then ends with the Doctor and Abigail on board the TARDIS, where the Doctor says that he'll try and get her back to her rightful time. Then he turns to her and says, "Or we could take the scenic route. Take in some new worlds, maybe find Chris along the way." Abigail says that the scenic route sounds nice before the Doctor says, "Okay then, scenic route it is." He then presses a few buttons, pulls a few switches, and sets the TARDIS into flight. Season 33 overall proved to be better received than Season 32. Many people took to the new Doctor and thought that Bonneville was a good pick for the role. Many fans were sad to see Bernice and Chris go, but were also intrigued to see what Abigail would be like as a full-time companion. It was agreed that it felt like the writers had probably figured out the 45-minute format after last season's mixed results. Viewing figures and ratings for the stories also remained fairly positive, which proved to the BBC and Carnival that this new era was indeed going to work.